Hey everyone, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Clive Barker's Underworld on Blu-ray. So obviously this isn't the Kate Beckinsale Vampires and Werewolves movie. This is a completely different film altogether. Clive Barker, for those of you who don't know, is a world-famous author, illustrator, and playwright, and an accomplished artist all around. And in literary circles, he's arguably best known for giving audiences the groundbreaking collection of horror stories, The Books of Blood, which were stories that combined raw sensuality and visceral blood and gore with a literary voice. And so, with the publication of the Books of Blood, Clive Barker seemed poised to become the quote unquote future of horror, in the words of Stephen King. And with the making of the film Hellraiser, which Barker wrote and directed, and based on his own novella, The Hellbound Heart, Barker definitely, went succeeded in becoming, say, a fixture of the horror genre, if not the future. But Clive Barker didn't limit himself to horror. He also dabbled in the realms of fantasy. I mean, case in point, he wrote one of my absolute favorite urban fantasy novels, Weave World. And if you want a good introduction to Clive Barker that's not going to make you lose your lunch, and if you want to see what the urban fantasy genre is capable of, I would highly recommend checking out Weave World. But prior to finding success with Hellraiser, Clive Barker had worked with a gentleman named George Pavlou to do a couple of films together. And the way the two of them met was at a party. And George Pavlou was someone who was wanting to make movies, and Clive Barker was someone who was wanting to write screenplays for movies. And so the two of them, came to realize that they both had a love for film as well as film noir, and they decided, hey, let's make a movie together. And so even though it says Clive Barker's Underworld on here, this isn't not based on any story of his. This is actually an original story that he came up with. And so while he does get some credit for his screenplay, the majority of the screenplay ended up being written by a guy named James Caplan. And so, while the initial idea of the movie was supposed to be a, sort of fun, gangsters and monsters movie, it was also supposed to kind of pose the question, of who the real monster was. I mean, was it man, or was it quote unquote monsters who were real monsters? And so, when you watch the movie, I mean, you can see, where it was, you know, trying to make a point, or you could at the very least, see what it was going for. And it does have, some intriguing, visual moments here and there, but with production design and lighting and, camera work and what have you. And there are moments where the dialogue, if not outright written by Clive Barker, at the very least reminds audiences who are familiar with his work of themes that he would go on to explore in other books or movies. And so the movie is interesting in the sense of seeing where Clive Barker started out as far as filmmaking goes. Because even though the majority of the actual screenplay ended up being done by someone else, the story came from him. And so with that in mind, Underworld was something that was not a success, and for a time it wasn't seen by a large audience. But when Hellraiser came out and was as successful as it was, Underworld was re-released in the States as Transmutations, and so they marketed it based on the success of Clive Barker's Hellraiser. And so, a few more people ended up seeing Underworld, but at the end of the day, Underworld just kind of, came and went. And that being said, though, I mean, Underworld, it's not a bad movie. It's just something that it's not good either, and it's not particularly engaging. It's just, at the end of the day, it's just kind of there. and a few moments of interest aside, but those are sporadic moments at best. But yeah, it was a movie that, being a fan of Clive Barker, uh, I'm glad I finally got to see it, and I was fortunate to be in a position where I was able to use a gift card, to buy this movie online, and so it's not like I had to spend my own money for it, and I'm thankful for that. Um, so I'm glad I finally got to see this movie because I read about it in the biography about Clive Barker, The Dark Fantastic, and I've read about the movie online here and there, and the original ideas sounded so much more ambitious and a lot more fascinating than what ended up being on film. But then again, considering that this was a low budget movie, I mean, they can only do so much in terms of, say, makeup and special effects. But it was the movie itself. It wasn't that good, but it wasn't a terrible movie. It just, it didn't really engage me. It was more interesting, finding out about the behind the scenes stuff, as well as, say, the fact that this is where Clive Barker got his start as far as the big screen goes. But but yeah, so let's go ahead and get into the story. So it starts off one night when this high class hooker named Nicole is kidnapped by a group of deformed people who live in the sewers. And the reason that they've kidnapped her is because they're all drug addicts to this white powdery substance called white man. And white man is something that is capable of allowing its user to manifest their thoughts and their desires. Like, their emotional state will physically manifest on their bodies, mutating them. And so while they might get a euphoric high from the experience, in the sense that they're able to be experiencing their thoughts and their emotions on a wholly new level, unfortunately is also very addictive, and it also leaves permanent deformities on the people using the drug. But the reason these mutants have kidnapped Nicole is because she too is an addict of white man, but she doesn't suffer from the deformities that the rest of them, the users, do. The ones that live underground in the sewers. Nicole, for some reason, is using the drug, but without becoming physically mutated or outwardly deformed like everyone else is. And so they kidnap her and bring her into the sewers. And one of them is a scientist named Nygaard, who is trying to do some tests on her, but unfortunately they're kind of limited as far as their resources and what they have to work with, and also they're running low on white man. And so in the meantime, though, there's a gentleman named Roy Bain, who's a detective, and he is actually someone who is a former lover of Nicole's, and the two of them were really close at one point, but then there was some kind of falling out, and Roy hasn't seen her in a long time, but he gets a quote unquote invite from a former colleague of his, a gentleman who has a hand in the criminal underworld, and his name is Hugo Motherskille. And Motherskille is someone that Roy Bain had worked with in the past, because prior to being a detective, he was a criminal, but he basically turned away from that life and wanted nothing more to do with it. But when Motherskille, had a couple of his henchmen, bring him over, he tells him about Nicole being kidnapped, and he's wanting Roy to find Nicole and rescue her, but also try and figure out, okay, who are the people that kidnapped her and why. And so Roy is kind of wondering why Motherskille is hiring him specifically to grab Nicole or to rescue Nicole. And so, Motherskille basically passes it off as, hey, he owes Nicole one, because, they were close back in the day. And he also owes Roy one, because the two of them worked well together when, they were both, working in the criminal underworld. And so Roy reluctantly agrees because he doesn't want to go back into the criminal underworld, but he also doesn't want to just, leave Nicole, to her fate, to whoever kidnapped her. And so as he's, doing his investigations, he's being monitored and followed by Motherskille and some of his agents. And, when, Roy comes to learn of Nicole's addiction to the drug, to white man, he's able to, find out that white man was invented by a guy named Dr. Savary, who is in fact the one who is responsible for the creation of the mutants who are living underground. And because turns out, see, that the mutants, I mean, they were originally ordinary, people who were drug addicts. But when Dr. Savary was testing the white man drug on them, that's when he discovered that the drug basically interacted with their thoughts and their desires, to the point where their bodies became physically mutated. And so with that in mind, basically he's kind of forced them to live as this underground community that's reliant on him, because he's the only one who can make the drug and who knows how to make it. But Savary, though, himself is also addicted in a way to Nicole, because Nicole was one of the people who got addicted to white man, and because she was struggling with her own drug issues. And so when she became hooked on white man, she became dependent on Savary, and Savary developed an obsession with her, and or an addiction, if you will. And so as Roy comes to learn all this, he also comes to learn that Motherskille had a very specific reason for hiring Roy to find Nicole, because he actually had worked with Dr. Savary, and was in some ways responsible for the creation of white man. I mean, Dr. Savary is the one who made it, but Motherskille kind of bankrolled him, and had some of his people help with Savary's work. But at the end of the day, though, I mean, you have multiple parties looking for Nicole for different reasons, and in the meantime, the mutant community that lives in this underworld are trying to find a cure for their condition, and also they're trying to find a way to have a steady supply of white man without having to rely on Dr. Savary. And so you have different agendas kind of colliding, and caught in the middle of all this is Roy, trying to rescue the woman that he, had loved for a long time, but, had been separated from. So that's basically, the gist of the movie. And so the idea of the movie, the premise of the movie is fascinating. I mean, because it really does feel like a detective story, albeit an amateur one, with and it was definitely an atmosphere of film noir, visually speaking, as well as, in tone. Um, but when it comes to, say, the science fiction and semi horror element of the story, it's not horror necessarily, but it's more like, a feeling of dark fantasy. But you come into a potential realm of science fiction, with this body altering drug. And so, I mean, these ideas were fascinating, really, because, I mean, you had this drug that literally interacts with your thoughts and dreams to manifest those thoughts and dreams, by physically distorting your body. I mean, fascinating ideas, but as shown on screen, though, I mean, the most it does is basically deforms, one's body, like to the point where, say, their, faces are swollen and puffy, or their eyes are kind of lopsided, that kind of thing. So nothing visually, stand out. Nothing that visually stands out, because it's like you hear what the drug is supposed to do, and the way it's described. I mean, you're thinking like this could be something, totally exotic, but unfortunately, I think part of it was because they were working on a low budget. The most they could do was just, deform, the actors, faces, with the makeup, of course. So they just sort of looked like troglodytes almost, or deformed, like someone with a severe, facial deformity, like, the Elephant Man or something like that. I mean, not quite that disturbing or anything, but just it's more along the lines of a deformity than a mutation. So it's disappointing in that regard. But also, if you listen to a commentary, and also just read some stuff online about the behind the scenes stuff for the movie, these mutations are supposed to be a lot more elaborate and fantastical. I mean, one example that's often cited is, in the original treatment, there was supposed to be, one of these, addicts, dreamed he was a tree, and he basically became a tree, like a tree human sort of hybrid almost. And that would have been fascinating to see on screen for sure, but I'm guessing something like that was out of the movie's price range, and so that's why the mutations aren't necessarily grabbers, but like the most that you'll see in terms of, say, someone changing is, say, like someone going from like a little troglodyte look to angry caveman look, that kind of thing. And as far as, say, the actors go, you actually have a pretty good cast of characters, or at least you have a good cast of actors playing these characters. But it's just, I guess, the way that the story's written, or the script is written, as well as the direction. I mean, it feels like the actors, like, while they are good actors, to be sure, in a sense that we've seen a lot of these people in other things. No one really, with the exception of Denholm Elliot as Dr. Savary, I mean, no one gives what I would call a good performance. It really comes across as either underplayed or overplayed, and seldom anything in the middle. For example, I mean, Stephen Berkoff, who is actually a good bad guy actor. I mean, he was the main villain in Beverly Hills Cop, and he was one of the main villains in Rambo: First Blood Part 2. So I mean, the guy's definitely got a good background in playing villains, but as Motherskille though, um, he basically comes across as like a mustache twirling over the top villain, and it's kind of hard to take him seriously, even though he's supposed to be the one of the main villains of the movie. So Stephen Berkoff unfortunately overplays it, so it's hard to take him seriously. Larry Lamb as Roy Bain. I have to admit, like visually, like you can kind of see this illustration of his character right there. Like visually speaking, um, Larry Lamb as Roy, looks cool. Like I mean, he looks like a detective, like an '80s detective, like you'd see on TV or on a book cover or something like that. But in some of his physical acting at times kind of corresponds with the emotion of the scene at hand. Like if he's you know trailing someone and trying not to make his presence known, I mean he has some good physical mannerisms in that regard to say convince the audience that his character is supposed to be a detective, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, though, when it comes to say his verbal acting, um, it, I guess the screenplay and Larry Lamb didn't necessarily mesh well together. Because at times, while he looks cool, he kind of comes across as someone who's underplaying the whole thing, or if he's not outright underplaying it, it just seems like he's posing as opposed to acting. And there are a couple of times where um, he abruptly um, goes over the top, just kind of out of the blue. Like he'll be sort of underplaying things and just sort of being there, and then suddenly he'll say something or demand something like out loud. And so it's not a very he doesn't do a good job, I think, of showing a transition of emotions. It's like it's like they were relying more on him looking cool, but unfortunately, like looking cool isn't the same as being cool, or at the very least being a good character. So yeah, Larry Lamb, I've seen him in a couple other things. I don't remember what, but I know I've seen him in some stuff. So he's actually a good actor. It's just in this particular movie, this probably isn't his best performance. Um, Denholm Elliot as Dr. Savary, though, it gives the best performance in the movie, I think, because he really does come across as like a comic book mad scientist, but at the same time, he does bring a sort of grounded feel to the character. Like you could tell that you know he's up to no good, and he's definitely a mad scientist, but at the same time, though, I mean, he has a sort of professional air about him that feels authentic, to where even if, he's got a bunch of stuff, bubbling up in his brain, a bunch of stuff, schemes and plots and what have you, he's able to control himself, to where, you know, he's got a, he's able to keep it together. Like, he doesn't come across as over the top like, Stephen Berkoff does, as Motherskille. Like, Denholm Elliot as Dr. Savary, is a better villain, I think. And there is a good moment of dialogue that he has when, like, he has Roy tied to like he has him at gunpoint, and he's forcing him to sit down on this surgical chair. And so he's telling him, and the two of them are talking about the whole white man drug, and the the whole existence of the Underworld mutants or the Underworlders, and Roy basically accuses him, rightly so, of being the one who got Nicole addicted to the drug. But Denholm Elliot, though, he delivers this line of dialogue where he basically tells him that, like when he's saying, he's saying that basically his own addiction, as in Dr. Savary's own addiction to Nicole, is far more painful, and so basically, like the way it's said, it sounds like something that Clive Barker would write. And even though this particular moment probably wasn't written by Clive Barker, because the majority of the script was done by James Caplan, it does feel like something that a Clive Barker character would say. And if you've read some of Clive Barker's other works, I mean, when it comes to, say, themes of addiction, or stuff like that, it definitely rings true. And so, Denholm Elliot probably has, the best moments of dialogue in the movie. As far as, say, like the other, some of the other people, I mean, you have well-known actress Miranda Richardson show up in a small role as one of the mutants, and I mean, she didn't do anything that stood out too much. But I thought she did play a good addict, because it's like all the mutants, they're deformed and everything, but you see, them, basically, being addicted to a drug and like junkies, right? And I thought Miranda Richardson, in the brief amount of time she was there, I mean, she does have some good moments where she comes across, she really does a good job of, playing a junkie, Yeah, like, as far as Nicole goes, the actress that played her was a lady named Nicola Cowper, and I thought that she looked good as Nicole, and she had a sort of punk new wave-ish look to her, and the way she's dressed up, I mean, it does look like something from a music video. Excuse me. But unfortunately, though, considering that her character is Nicole is the object of everyone's pursuit, she doesn't have much to do in the movie. Like a good amount of the time, she's passed out or she's walking around in a daze. Like the most she does is at the end. But since we're supposed to care about her, like it's kind of difficult to care about her because I mean she looks good and everything, but she doesn't really do much in the movie. So I think the momentum of the movie might have been helped if Nicola had more to do as Nicole, and as far as dialogue and what have you, and that would have probably helped her character development, helped us to care, because with Roy pursuing her and having been in love with her at one point, and he still was in love with her, and then you have Dr. Savary wanting to get her back because he's addicted to her, and then you have the mutants trying to get her because they're trying to figure out how she's immune to the drug's deformities and how they could use that to their advantage. Usually when someone's the focus of that much attention, the writers actually try to make the audience care about that person, but they don't really give her much to do, and so as a result we really don't find a reason to care about her. And as far as the mutants go, I mean, I feel like if the problem with them had just been limited to the low budget appearance of their deformities, I mean, I could have lived with that. But unfortunately, while we do have some actors who have shown that they're good actors in other material, the script, the lines of dialogue they're given sound kind of juvenile at times, or at the very least amateur. One of the mutants who's got this facial deformity. He introduces himself as Doo-Doo, and so it's kind of like, you have a couple of them who, I mean, yeah, they're junkies and everything, and you have at least one of them trying to you know actually do some constructive research and what have you. But for the most part, the lines of dialogue we get are basically something that sounds like a teenager or a little kid wrote it, that kind of thing. um, and as far as the action goes, um, there are some moments where you have these, like, you have shots of some of the characters, like getting ready to charge into action, and as isolated shots they look good, but unfortunately, though, when it comes to the actual action, like the fighting or the shootouts, I mean, the physical fighting, I mean, it doesn't look terrible, but at the same time, there's nothing that's really grabbing you. Like, it looks like something you'd see on TV or something like that, like on a cop show in the '80s. But I think the main problem, though, is like when it comes to like the shootouts and what have you. I mean, you have villains who are, you know when they're shooting, it looks like, I don't know, they're in a music video or something. And so when people are getting shot, or like some of the underworlders are getting shot, I mean, the way they're falling, it looks like they're dancing in a music video. And so it's like the action, I think, could have benefited more from better choreography. But as it is, I mean, I see why people, they look at this movie and they feel like it's something, from MTV or something like that, because at times it does look like a music video, and not necessarily in a good way. But at the same time, there are some nice visual moments. Like, there's, like the opening scene, like with the opening credit sequence. I mean, there's like this, surreal quality to the scene, because it's like, we're, being shown inside the brothel where Nicole works, and it's all done. It's sort of like this, dreamlike slow motion shot, and it's very visually intriguing. Like the way it's used, and the way it shows the people in the brothel and everything. So there are moments like that. And some of the designs, while definitely dated, at the very least, they do show an attempt at, the film noir, approach. Like, say, in terms of lighting and what have you, or how characters are posed, or things like that. Um, but other than, say, those brief moments of visual flair, um, a lot of the movie just looks kind of amateur, and like a lot of the designs, when they're not being skillfully used, I mean, consist of, say, buildings or rooms with a bunch of neon thrown in. Like when you're underground in the sewers, I mean, yeah, you have some bits of graffiti on the wall, but there's also a crap ton of neon in the place, and it doesn't look like a sewer. It looks like a beauty salon, that kind of thing. So it's ironic, though, that there is this music video look to the movie, but George Pavlou, I mean, in the commentary, he's talking about how frustrated he gets whenever people, mention that to him, how it looks like a music video, and he's like, it's not a music video I was going for. It was a comic book I was going for. It was like a comic book feel. And so, having listened to the commentary, and hearing him say that, when I was watching the movie a second time, and this was the first time I watched the movie, just by itself, and then the second time I watched it with the commentary. And when he said that, I could definitely see, there is a comic book feel to things. And so at least the effort's there, and I can definitely see what they're going for. So it's more comic booky than music video. So so at the very least they were trying for something. But at the same time though, when the choreography, is, you know, um, when when the choreography seems to come from, like the dancing in a music video or something like that, and when you have villains that tend to be over the top, and with the exception of say one of them, and then when you have a protagonist that it's difficult to care about, and then you have the object of everyone's attention, doing little to deserve that attention, at least as far as we could see. I mean, it's really hard to care about things. I mean, there is like one moment, I guess, as far as action scenes go, where one of the mutant addicts of White Man um, breaks into Roy's home and attacks a lady friend of his, who's also a prostitute, but she's actually someone who was friends with him back in the day and reconnected him with him because of this case, because she knew Nicole. But there is this one semi well done scene where he, this mutant though, he breaks into Roy's place in an attempt to have his way with his lady friend. Um, and so like when you see him sort of going through the stages of the mutation and what have you, I mean, it's nothing elaborate, but like at first he sort of looks like a caveman with warts and everything, but then when he goes all feral and what have you, like his eyes are red, like you kind of see it right here. And so, I mean, nothing too elaborate, but at the same time, there is a certain amount of, effort made, and there's some energy put into the sequence, when Roy and him, fight it out and what have you. So at the very least, there is some effort being made. But with the exception of, that particular scene, none of the action scenes, really managed to strike home, at least in my opinion. Um, and also, there are moments where they do try to, go for deeper themes. And while there are some moments where, you know, lines of dialogue do ring true, I mean, they're isolated moments. Like there's the aforementioned bit where Dr. Savary, says that, his addiction to Nicole is a lot more painful, and the way he says it, I mean, that was an example. But you also have, a moment where um, Roy is investigating Nicole's room at the brothel, and he's asking the madam, who was actually played by let's see, Ingrid Pitt, who was an old-time horror actress, I believe. She plays the madam of the place, and Roy's asking her character about Nicole, and there's a rather fascinating conversation that they have about fantasies, and you know because she's explaining how Nicole basically became whatever fantasy her client wanted, and that could be a comment on her skill as a prostitute. But when you find out about the body altering effects of the white man drug, that could be something that basically allowed her to become you know the person that her clients wanted her to be, albeit without physically changing, but somehow she was able to, I guess, bring it out or something. So it's kind of a double line, a bit of dialogue that has some double meaning. So I mean, I liked that moment though. So you do have the moments where the dialogue rings true, and you get a glimpse of what this movie could have been. Like it could have been a lot more intellectual. Um, but with the exception of those moments, though, um, the plot and the dialogue really come across as hollow for the most part, or you know it doesn't really um, drive the plot along, or the dialogue doesn't really serve to give any momentum, to the movie, with those few exceptions. And it's just when those moments happen, it's kind of frustrating because you have those good moments of dialogue, but the rest of the movie is just sort of inane. As far as the screenplay and as far as like how things are executed, because it's actually even with the action scenes, partially because one, how badly choreographed they are, as well as the fact that it's difficult to really care about whatever's going on screen, because it's difficult to care about the characters, because the screenplay doesn't really give us much to go on with them, as it's shown on screen anyway. I'm not too sure like how like the original story would be, or like how the original script would be, like if it would be any better. But as far as what's on screen here, it's just difficult to care about things, at least for me anyway. Um, yeah, because of that, like there were a lot of moments where I was kind of just like, kind of look at my phone instead of focusing on the movie, simply because of, the fact that it was dragging, and also it was predictable. Like you knew right off the bat that Stephen Berkoff's character was going to be a bad guy and everything, and it's no surprise when he's revealed to be having his people tail Roy Bain. Um, so you know what's going to happen plot wise, um, and but also you don't really care about anyone, that you're having to go along with for the plot. So the movie itself, like it's has some sporadic moments of interest, and there is a good effort with to have like this film noir atmosphere, um, and there is it also does like have this comic book feel to it. So it's like the effort is there, and there are some moments where the energy does shine through, and we kind of get a glimpse at a more intriguing movie. But unfortunately, partially because I guess the low budget, and also because of the execution of things, what could have been a fascinating movie altogether is one that's instead boring throughout the majority of the film. So so yeah, watching this movie, it's kind of like I'm glad I saw it, is simply because I mean I'm a fan of Clive Barker's, and it's fascinating to see what his first work on a film was, at the very least, as far as come up with a story and what have you. Because knowing his further work, I mean, you could pick up on themes that would be further and better explored, in other works of his that are on hand here. But unfortunately, the themes that he attempts, that I should say, that they attempt to explore, here, I mean, it really comes across as amateur, and in a way, it was amateur, because this was Clive Barker's first crack at working on a movie, writing wise. And George Pavlou, I mean, it was his first real film too. Um, so with this amateur approach, the moments where certain themes are brought up and they try to explore, you know it's like, yeah, the theme's there, but you don't really care about it. Whereas if you look at something like, say, Cabal, or its film adaptation Nightbreed, you know some of the themes that are brought up here, such as who's the real monster, man or quote unquote monster, you know themes like that are brought up here, but they're far better explored in Cabal or Nightbreed. And as far as say like the main character being a private eye, um, having a private eye story is always good. I mean, or as far as it's a good source of fun, but as far as how the private eye angle is done in this movie, like it feels sort of artificial, and Barker would go on to go back into the private eye field with the character of Harry D'Amour, who first made his appearance in the short story The Last Illusion, and that in turn was made into the movie The Lord of Illusions, which Clive Barker also wrote and directed, and it starred Scott Bakula as Harry D'Amour. So Barker did get better at developing private eye characters as protagonists. It's just that here, though, the way Roy Bain's written and the way his actor performs him, it just feels kind of lifeless. I mean, yeah, the guy looks good, but there's really not much to him as far as substance goes. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and give Underworld a 2 out of 5 stars. It was okay, like not terrible, but at the same time, it was just sort of there, and background noise at best. The background noise that makes you perk up every now and then, but for the most part, it's kind of like you're probably inclined to look at the phone or look at the paper, that kind of thing. But as far as special features go, you have a wonderful commentary track with director George Pavlou, and it's moderated by a guy named Stephen Thrower, who's the author of, I believe it's either a magazine or a book called Nightmare USA. It's a wonderful commentary track, and it's funny because when I was watching the movie the first time, when I was just watching the movie by itself, that's when I was mainly more inclined to check out my phone or read something than I was to watch the movie because, well, it was kind of boring. But when I was watching it the second time and listening to the commentary track, that's when I actually watched the whole movie because the commentary does a good job of talking about what's going on the screen and how certain aspects of the film came to be, but they do a good job of engaging with you, like engaging with the audience and getting them interested in what's going on screen, even if the actual movie isn't that good. So yeah, it's fascinating, and also you kind of get a good inside look as to the chaotic nature of making this movie, because it was like they were always under budget, and a lot of the stuff that they wanted to do they couldn't do, special effects wise, and also you had studio heads who kept on insisting on a horror movie not being but they didn't want it to be a horror movie. They wanted it to be more, of an action, film, with, detectives, cops and robbers and things like that. Whereas, Barker was wanting to have more of a focus on horror, but because, the studio execs were like, we don't like horror, or they didn't get Clive Barker's, take on horror, that's why one of the reasons why they had this other screenwriter James Caplan come in and basically redo the thing. And there are some moments where in the commentary where you learn of some of James Pavlin's additions to the screenplay, and there is one instance where I felt like his contribution ended up being better than Clive Barker's, because as Clive Barker originally wrote the character of Roy Bain, Roy Bain was basically a very cynical, washed-out private eye who also moonlit as a pimp for underage prostitutes, underage girls, and so there, So in the commentary, George Pavlou and Stephen Thrower, when they talk about that, they're like, oh, that was one instance where where George Pavlou felt that James Caplan's handling of the situation was better than Clive Barker's, in a sense of how he wrote the character was better than how Clive Barker wrote the character, because when James Caplan came in, he changed it to where they had to change it to where Roy was a much more calm and collected individual. He was someone who was at peace with himself, although he was haunted by, the loss of, his love, Nicole. As far as, the two of them, they loved each other, but they broke up and he never got over it. So there is that. But for the most part, though, he's able to, have a place in the world and function and kind of enjoy life. So that was, where Caplan's contribution was better than Clive Barker's, I think, because it would have been harder to sympathize with Barker's take, according to Pavlou, and I'm actually inclined to agree. But you also learn a couple other things. I mean, you learn about how there was this one individual who was involved in the movie that actually got killed in a robbery, and it was like a drug deal gone wrong kind of thing. And George Pavlou's talking about how they're getting ready to shoot a scene, and then the PA there was an announcement that this one particular individual had been murdered, and they announce it right as they're going to shoot the scene, and that just totally brought everything down. And so, because it was hard for people to focus and what have you, because it was shocking news. And so, George Pavlou was talking about how, unprofessional it was, and how, most, productions, worth their salt, they wait until after a scene is filmed, before to tell, the crew of some bad news along those lines, because it's like, they want the people to be able to be in the moment and carry the scene, but unfortunately, the way it was handled on, the set of Underworld, it really just threw a lot of people off, and, it slowed things down. But, and also you kind of learn about how, Pavlou, was, felt very guilty about having to, tell Clive Barker that his screenplay wasn't going to be used, that, they were going to go with the other guys. And, and he was trying to, and it was one of those instances where both of them knew that, it wasn't necessarily either one's fault. It's just, the studio, right? And so it's like Clive Barker was pissed off, but he wasn't pissed off at George Pavlou. And so, but unfortunately, though, that did kind of, dampen their working relationship. And so, so it's like the one other time the two of them worked together was on the movie Rawhead Rex, which was an adaptation of, a short story of the same name by Clive Barker. But even then, there was a lot of studio interference. But it was more so, there was more studio interference in Underworld, if I remember correctly, than there was Rawhead Rex, at least from what I remember of the commentary. In listening to the commentary, though, it just, it's one of the better commentaries I've listened to, in a sense that, even though the movie itself isn't good, the commentary made me, more interested in the movie, and, watching, what was going on screen while listening to, the people talk about it. So, yeah, the commentary track on Underworld was really good. And then you also have Transmutations, the 103-minute alternate cut, which is slightly longer than this 92-minute, the original version. In Transmutations, I'll be honest, I haven't watched that particular version yet, but I heard, though, that that's the American version, and so it's like there's a couple of scenes that I think it's like they throw it in throw certain scenes in as padding, or it feels more actionized. Maybe I've heard a little bit of both, but I haven't watched it yet. But if I remember correctly, though, um, transmutations. I mean, it was when Underworld was marketed as Transmutations state. That was when it was being marketed stateside, and that was when they were trying to capitalize on Clive Barker's fame with the movie Hellraiser. So I'll probably be checking it out at some point. But there's also archival behind the scenes footage where you see like stuff like people prepping for a shot, or how some of the makeup's being made, but it's all still still photos. Then you also have artwork, stills, storyboards, makeup tests, and Clive Barker designs. And some of that stuff was pretty cool because you see some of the ideas of what they're originally wanting to do. Like one of the things that you actually see visualized in the storyboards, and something that George Pavlou is talking with Stephen Thrower about in the commentary, and also something that you can find online, or learn about online. At the climax of the movie, they were wanting to have this one villain get this really nasty death by way of special effects. And what they were going to originally what they storyboarded was they were going to have Nicole force this guy to quote unquote show her his dreams. And namely, she basically turns the tables on him, and she's basically using the white man drug to basically force him to manifest his dreams. Except in this guy's case, instead of just getting deformed like all the other all the other people who are hooked on white man, she's forcing his body to manifest itself as basically his darkest secret, or his darkest thoughts. And so what ends up happening is the guy starts convulsing, and his skin starts to bulge, and then you see these pinpricks start to poke out of his face, and then these hypodermic needles just basically burst out of his flesh, and to a point where it's like it's mainly focused on his face, but then you also see like these hypodermic needles puncturing their way out of his flesh all over his body. But most of the focus is on the face, though. And so the guy literally just becomes a human pincushion, and he's reduced to like a bloody skeleton with needles coming out of his face. And while that image would definitely go on to sort of influence the look of the character Pinhead from Hellraiser, amongst other influences that character had, that particular shot was never used, even though they actually did come up with a special effects animatronic unit for that. Like they had the bloody skeleton with the needles sticking out of its skull. I mean, they had that set up and ready to go. But unfortunately, though, it was like an issue of time and money. It was like either it was a sequence that would have taken 3 days to shoot, and they only had 1 day, and so they had to throw something together to basically serve as this climactic explosion, right? Except instead of the Cronenbergian body horror that they were originally wanting to do, they just had this particular villain get a fiery demise by way of scanners, like namely his head bursts into flames. Like there's some bulging of his flesh, and you see some blood because some of it's peeling off, but you see like a brief moment like that. But instead of that awesome idea of having the hypodermic needles punch their way out of his flesh, the guy's head just bursts into flames, like something from Scanners. And no disrespect towards Scanners, because Scanners is a good movie, but it's just so many other movies have tried to imitate the whole exploding head bit, or the body bursting into flames, by way of pyrokinesis, or telepathy, or what have you. um, and so we have this moment that's kind of building up in the movie like that. And but unfortunately, when we get to the punchline, as it were, it's very flat and disappointing. So the storyboards and stuff, it were interesting to see, because it was fascinating seeing how that sequence would have looked, had it been put on screen. But fortunately, we didn't get that. So yeah, Underworld, 2 out of 5 stars. It was okay, but the behind the scenes stories and artwork were a lot more interesting than the actual movie, though. So, but things did get better for Clive Barker. So, thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. You got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So, y'all take care. Have a good night.